Stephen Gethins.
Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, to ask the Minister if she will make a statement on the outcome of parliamentary elections in Georgia. Thank you.
I thank the right honourable gentleman for his question. Following the elections in Georgia on the 26th of October, the Minister for Europe, North America and the Overseas Territories made clear our support for the findings of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institution and Human Rights Election Monitoring Mission preliminary report on the election. That report highlighted a range of concerns, including frequent breaches of voter secrecy, procedural inconsistencies and reports of intimidation and pressure on voters which had a negative impact on public trust in the process. This has seriously damaged Georgia's international reputation, and I hereby reiterate our call on the Government of Georgia to implement the recommendations issued by the OSCE Monitoring Mission after the publication of its final report, because Georgia and the UK have enjoyed a long history and close bilateral relations, and we have fully supported Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations in line with the strong will of the Georgian people and previously supported the Georgian government's reform agenda. However, since gaining EU accession status almost 1 year ago, we've seen several measures introduced by the Georgian government which have taken the country on a harmful trajectory away from European values and seen an increase in anti-Western rhetoric by the government. Minister Broughty spoke with Georgian Foreign Minister Dashashvili on the 9th of October to relay the UK's concerns about the introduction of a law on transparency and foreign influence and a law on family values, and on 11th of October reiterated our concern as to how this contributed to pressure on civil society and human rights. These actions undermined Georgian citizens' clear ambition for a modern, inclusive, Euro-Atlantic future and jeopardised the UK's close partnership with the Georgian Dream government. People in Georgia are making clear their opposition to Georgian Dream's decision to pause the country's further moves towards a European future. I'm deeply concerned by reports of excessive use of force by Georgian police against protesters exercising legitimate democratic rights. Minister Broughty this morning released a statement condemning the continued use of brutal force that has continued over recent days, and we've called on the Georgian authorities to de-escalate the situation, reverse their harmful trajectory away from European values, and continued steps away from democratic norms and freedoms will only serve to harm Georgia's international reputation and risk fundamentally damaging relations with Georgia's friends and partners. The UK government has already decided to review its relations with the government, including by freezing of our annual wardrop strategic dialogue, until we see signs of a reversal of this anti-democratic slide.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I first of all thank you for granting this urgent question? As you'll be aware, there are friendships across this chamber with people in Georgia who will be reassured that we have taken the time to discuss this today. I'd also like to refer to my register of interests as a trustee of the John Smith Trust, who have done some fantastic work in Georgia and elsewhere, and I hope, Mr. Speaker, you don't mind me mentioning that. Georgia is a country in which I've lived and worked, and I know other colleagues have done so as well, and like others here, care for very deeply. The Minister was right, and I thank her for her statement. I'd also like to highlight the work she's highlighted of her ministerial colleagues, the excellent work of the Embassy in Tbilisi, and also UK-based international NGOs who have done fantastic work for years. We've been so disturbed in the aftermath of those elections, and the dangers of destabilisation in Georgia are acute when 20% of Georgia's territory is still under Russian control. It's occupied. So can the Minister tell us, further to her statement, what discussions has she had with European partners over Georgia's EU accession, which is vital to the long-term stability of Georgia? What work is ongoing to ensure that the rule of law is enshrined and fortified, and also ensuring that we have freedom of media and the freedom of journalists and the freedom to protest? And finally, having visited the border with Russia recently, what work is being done to ensure Georgia maintains sanctions on Russia, regardless of the administration in Tbilisi? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Could I thank my right honourable friend for his commitment to Georgia and his intimate knowledge of it, and could I also underline the importance of his points around freedom of the press? We need to know what's happening, and also the freedom to protest. Obviously, following an election campaign, emotions were running high, but it's never acceptable to have police brutality. And it's so important that people, particularly those who wish to express their views, are able to do that safely. So I thank him for laying that on the record. And in relation to the discussion that my colleague, the Minister for Europe and the US and the Americas, he underlined the importance of UK support for the democratic process, but also some of the irregularities during the election campaign, which worried us as those partners during the election proceedings. And he will be aware that we've called for an investigation into the irregularities so that we can be clear that the result was correct. And also we have taken the decision just to pause our discussions at political level until there is more stability, and in that time we can see how things develop, how the new government forms and so on. But he is right to lay out his concerns, and we will relay those concerns not just from ourselves as a government but from this Parliament.
So the Select Committee have Niton.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I read with some alarm the reports about the Georgian elections, including a report by the OSCE, which talks about vote buying, multi-voting, Russian disinformation and intimidation. Is the Minister aware that the European Parliament last Thursday passed a motion stating that those elections had neither been free or fair and should be rerun? I wondered if the British position was the same.
I thank the Chair of the Select Committee for her intimate knowledge of the elections in Georgia, and our position currently is to monitor the situation. We're looking carefully at what European partners say, but we are also encouraging Georgian authorities to determine any complaints, because there have been a number of complaints regarding the irregularities, and we're clear that all of those irregularities should be thoroughly investigated. And in addition, we're calling on peaceful demonstration for an end to any police brutality, for an exercise of restraint and a respect for the process of the formation of a new government. So while we are not calling for a rerun of the election, we do want to know what the outcome of the investigation into irregularities might be.
The Liberal Democrat spokesperson, Commonwealth.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. The suspension of Georgia's EU accession process is the latest, of course.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm grateful to the Minister for her remarks so far. The shocking and disturbing scenes in Georgia have been hard for all of us to witness, and I note the statement put out by the Foreign Office this morning. We share the government's deep anxiety about the situation in Georgia. Mr. Speaker, what is happening in Georgia matters, from the law on foreign influence to election irregularities to the excessive use of force in recent days against protesters and journalists. We are witnessing Georgia being dragged down a dangerous path. It matters, of course, for the Georgian people, for our important bilateral relationship and for the wider Euro-Atlantic community that sincerely seeks closer ties and a deeper friendship with Georgia. Our clear and unambiguous aim here should be to support the Georgian people, and that includes their desire for a future rooted in the Euro-Atlantic community. So, can the Minister confirm that she has told her Georgian counterpart, in no uncertain terms, that they need to tone down the aggressive rhetoric, de-escalate the situation on the streets and stop blaming others for the current tensions? Will she also commit to pulling every diplomatic lever to support the Georgian people as they go through this dark period? Finally, and more broadly, I want to circle back to the question I asked last week at Foreign Office oral questions, because this is a very clear example of the dangers of Europe becoming a more contested space. Will the Minister now urgently come forward with a plan that builds on the work of the last government to be much more muscular with leveraging our soft power so that we can counter attempts to sow division and bang the drum for the Euro-Atlantic community? We need to demonstrate to countries both in Europe and around the world that a partnership with us and choosing democracy and openness is the best route to prosperity.
thank the spokesperson for her comments. And of course, we do believe that the Georgian authorities must investigate all irregularities and reverse the declining commitment to democracy, as she's laid out. We fully support Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations, in line with the strong will of the Georgian people. And because Georgia is a valuable international security partner in the South Caucasus, with whom we enjoy a long history and close bilateral relations, we are redoubling our efforts to connect with Georgians and to encourage restraint, to encourage peace and peaceful demonstrations, and also to encourage the investigation of those irregularities, so that there can be no doubt about what actually happened in the election that's just passed. The UK remains resolutely committed to Georgia's independence and territorial integrity within its internationally recognised borders. And the Honourable Lady has asked about soft power. And of course, in this House, we all know how important soft power is, and that's why we're working very hard on, for example, the British Council, the groups that support democracy and young people in different democracies. And that's why we are rebuilding, following 14 years of quite difficult time for soft power in the UK, as all the funding has drained away from important soft power organisations. And we are seeking to rebuild our reputation for soft power, where perhaps we have stepped backwards a little over the last few years.
Jopa.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My Georgian friends and colleagues in civil society who I've worked with for many years are calling this a Maidan moment for the country. Protesters have been brutally assaulted and there are reports of journalists hospitalised. Given many Georgian Dream officials have ties to the UK, will my right honourable friend consider that if this continues, the full range of government tools will be considered, for example, sanctions, visa bans or financial restrictions that would hit those responsible where it really hurts?
Could I thank the chair of the APPG on anti-corruption for his pointed question and his support for freedom of the press. We know that journalists must be able to report and must be free to report the facts. And he tempts me to speculate, but he knows that I won't go there in terms of any future sanctions arrangements, because we always keep those quiet until we actually make the announcement for obvious reasons. But in terms of his commentary about the backsliding on freedom of the press and indeed on the links that there are between Georgia and the UK, we will certainly investigate all of those. And if he has any specific questions or concerns in relation to any of those matters, could he please write to us and we will investigate them.
Liberal Democrat spokesperson Callum Miller.
Thank you again, Mr. Speaker. The suspension of Georgia's EU accession process is the latest troubling step taken by the pro-Russian Georgian government, and I welcome the assurance that the government is pressing for the investigation of irregularities in that election. But the use of excessive force against protesters and journalists is unacceptable. Political and democratic rights should be protected, and free and open political protest must be permitted. So what further steps can the UK government take to raise these issues with the Georgian government? The US has decided to suspend their strategic partnership with Georgia. I heard the Minister say that the government is pausing UK engagement. But can she tell the House under what conditions she would follow the US and go further formally to suspend the UK strategic partnership? Finally, the UK and the EU must speak with one voice in opposing democratic backsliding and Russian interference in Georgia. So how is the Minister strengthening the UK's dialogue with our EU partners to roll back Russian influence and support democratic groups in Georgia?
Thank the Liberal Democrat spokesperson for his fulsome questions, and certainly in terms of our involvement in the region, we did back and pay for observers for the election period, and we are waiting to hear on the investigations of the irregularities. And the UK's position currently is, due to our growing concerns over Georgia's negative Euro-Atlantic trajectory, as is mentioned, going away from the EU, and democratic backsliding, including the laws on transparency and foreign influence and family values, in June 2024, the UK did decide to freeze the annual Wardrop UK-Georgia Strategic Dialogue and Defence Staff talks. We use a suspension initially because we want to appear reasonable and we want to have them being reasonable back. But of course, that does not preclude future more defining actions if we have to.
Sir John Whittingdale.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Minister will be aware of widespread reports of vote buying, ballot stuffing, carousel voting with people voting multiple times in the Georgian election. And this comes just a few weeks after very similar reports that we heard from Moldova, where again there was massive electoral interference. Can the Minister say what more we can do to help countries who are trying to move away from Russia's orbit and become more democratic, and to stop Russian interference in those elections?
The Right Honourable Gentleman has a long history of raising these sorts of concerns in the House, and I thank him for that. And we know that the Georgian government showed no sign of taking seriously the need to make as much progress as what the UK wanted, and indeed took retrograde steps, harming progress towards EU membership, and of course passing the laws where the aims were to designate NGOs, media outlets operating in Georgia that receive more than 20% funding from abroad as agents of foreign influence, which of course is an excuse to crack down. But specifically on his points about the coercion of voters and an atmosphere of pressure on civil society, in response, of course, the opposition parties refused to take up their seats. And so we are watching very carefully, and Minister Doherty has spoken to Tbilisi, and also, of course, our excellent mission there is monitoring very carefully and reporting back on a daily basis in terms of the formation of the new group. And if he emails Minister Doherty, he will give him a day-by-day and blow-by-blow description.
David Chadwick.
Madam Deputy Speaker, what kind of conversations is the government having with counterparts in Georgia to ensure that the right to assemble and the freedom to protest are being respected?
I thank the relatively newly elected member and thank him for his question. And he's quite right. We all know, for those of us who participate in elections, how emotional elections can be. But that's no excuse for police brutality in terms of how protesters are treated, should they be wanting to protest either about coercion during the elections, how the elections took place, or about the result itself. And I'm very pleased that he's raised in the House today the importance of restraint, the importance of pushing back against the atmosphere of pressure on civil society. It's particularly disheartening to see young people who are so excited about a more open future and a freedom of the press and a freedom to associate and have a hopeful future, to see them being cracked down on in the way that they do. And I thank him for his question.
Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I congratulate my honourable friend for Arbroath and Broughty Ferry on securing this urgent question. Last week, the European Parliament called for a rerun of these elections, describing them as being neither free nor fair, and accusing the ruling party of being fully responsible for the democratic backsliding in Georgia. Could I ask, why hasn't the UK government gone as far as the European Parliament in calling for a rerun of these elections? And will she commit to sharing the evidence that she gets on the electoral irregularities? And what representations has the Minister or the FCDO made to the Georgian ambassador in the UK about the road in which the people of Georgia are being forced down?
Good question.
I thank the member for his question and also for his general interest in foreign policy matters in this House. And he will be aware that the Minister for Europe, North America and the Overseas Territories made clear the UK's support for the findings of the OSCE Office for Democratic Institutions and Human Rights Election Monitoring preliminary report on the election, and indeed paid for or supported the programme with 50 observers to the elections. And their report does highlight irregularities. And of course, while the investigations into those electoral irregularities is ongoing, the reasonable position to take was to wait for the investigations to come forward so that we can understand exactly what went on, how much coercion there was, and then as a result to speak to our interlocutors, the Georgian ambassador, but also our mission in Tbilisi, talking to government figures to impress upon them the impact on their international reputation, to have a whole lot of young people outside on public squares protesting. And so what we've done is we've called on the government of Georgia to implement the recommendations issued by the monitoring mission after the publication of the report, and so that we can use that and the facts in that report to base our policy on that. But as I explained to the chair of the Select Committee, we haven't quite got the identical position to European partners, but we want to take a reasonable position which asks questions, but it doesn't preclude taking firmer action later if we remain concerned about the way that the government formation occurs following this election.
Jim Shannon.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. Again, I thank the Minister very much for her answers. And freedom, liberty and democracy are vital for Georgia to have an unfettered, stable government, and that people can express themselves without any violence. It's clear that Russia has influenced the election negatively, and the influence of government. Minister, how can our government work in tandem with those who want to have the democracy that every Georgian citizen wants and deserves? And can I ask the Minister this question as well? In relation to the British Embassy in Tbilisi, has it enough staff and resources to respond to all of the British citizens that are in Tbilisi? What advice is given to them in relation to do they stay or what do they do? Thank you.
Well done, Jack.
I thank the member for Strangford's ongoing commitment to freedom, to peaceful relations, to interest, to keeping the UK's reputation for supporting democracies so live in this House. And I know that the mission in Tbilisi will be watching this and reading this urgent question and hear his concerns and his question. And we know that it's so important to support Georgia's Euro-Atlantic aspirations in line with the strong will of the Georgian people over the last few years, particularly in light of the conflict in the close neighbourhood, which of course is Ukraine. And that's why we've been such a strong supporter of democratic reforms over many years, working with Parliament, civil society, independent media and government to support the reforms and Georgia's continued progress towards membership of the Euro-Atlantic community. So, as he has asked the resource question, the mission in Tbilisi is well resourced. We have excellent professionals there working very closely on understanding the exact investigation into the irregularities of the election, as well as trying to see what's actually happening with the formation of the new government post-election, as well as trying to call for restraint so that those battles outside on the squares do not turn into any form of police brutality, but do retain that vision of freedom and of democracy.
Pippa Heylings.
Thank you. Having met with young people here in the UK who are Georgians, watching with desperation and fear and depression their future, which has seen the legislation in terms of foreign influence restricting their rights, both of media but also of organisations dealing with all sorts of development rights, but also seeing their colleagues brutally repressed in the streets when they're just trying to have freedom of association, freedom from the right to keep what is enshrined in their constitution, which is the movement towards EU accession, being ripped away from them. What can you say to those young people? And will the Minister and the Ambassador be open to meet with them? As I say, they are in a terrible, terrible state of anxiety right now.
I thank the Honourable Lady for her concern and her impassioned plea for peaceful expression of political views, but also for the UK to play its role in supporting that vision for freedom, but also in supporting a stable assessment following the election, acting on the information and investigation material that's come forward from the report, which of course we supported the election observers, so we need to listen to what they say as a result of those investigations. But also could I thank her for her condemnation of the brutal and excessive force used against protesters and journalists. And I will certainly pass back her exhortation to be on the side of those with vision and on those with wanting to freely express their points of view.